Great summary. So I'm intrigued when you say they use it to inform. Uh, is there an example where it is more impactful within the construct of all the different tools that they have available? And when they say inform, are there aspects of the framework that they put more credence in or less credence?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did some informational interviews with this same panel earlier this year and shared this information at AMCP. And when we talked with folks in the information interviews, you can delve a little bit more deeply, explore the nuance. And in those two types of decision contexts that I mentioned, coverage and reimbursement, price negotiations, what we consistently heard is if there is a value-based price available from ICER, it's going to be used in price negotiations. That's really the sweet spot for payers, is having a leverage point for those negotiations. Mm-hmm. So you asked about parts of the framework that might be more or less valuable, more or less interesting, helpful. ICER recently released its new updated framework. Periodically, it updates the framework throughout the years, and we just saw the new framework drop. So this was really potentially an exciting world for those of us in the value assessment space. There were some broad stakeholder consensus on what we would hope to see. And the bottom line is ICER really didn't make some substantive changes to the framework. It's pretty similar to what we've seen. So let me tell you a little bit about changes we saw, changes we didn't see. Process, I think, is interesting. Not many people are talking about the process, and then give you an idea of where ICER might head into the future. So first, changes we didn't see. I mentioned there's cross-stakeholder consensus on some changes like elevating the societal perspective. The societal perspective tends to take a broader view. It's more patient-centered, and we didn't see that elevation of the societal perspective over what ICER uses as its base case perspective, which is the health plan perspective. Similarly, we didn't see a broadening of patient-centered factors like caregiver burden in a quantitative way. Changes that we did see some important nods to health equity, to patient engagement, and that's really encouraging. Those are important areas of conversation in the value assessment space. The Innovation and Value Initiative is doing a lot in both of those areas. What remains to be seen for me is really how all of this unfolds. Historically, we've tended to see the focus on equity and patient engagement unfold as part of the qualitative narrative, really the value story in ICER's value assessment, which is important, but we haven't seen as much of an impact in terms of the results, the quantitative answer that we see. So that's what I'll be looking for is, do we really see a meaningful change as a result of these nods to equity and patient engagement?
What specifically would you like to see in terms of equity outcomes and equity assessment?
I would like to see more than lip service to equity. What we've seen, well, let me take a step back. Let me focus on one of the nods that we've seen here, which I think is important. ICER has an independent value assessment committee that votes on questions related to value. And historically, there has been a vote about impact of equity of whatever the treatment is that's under consideration. And under the old value assessment framework, we saw some confounding of what it might mean to have an impact on equity. So what does that mean, confounding? There were two ways to really think about equity, the way that the committees were voting on it. One way was thinking about, is this a treatment that could help an underserved population? And in that instance, you might look at a vote and say, oh, this is a positive step for equity. Providing access to this treatment helps the underserved population. Where that was getting confounded was with the idea of affordability and will this underserved population that needs this treatment be able to access and afford the treatment. And what we were seeing in the votes under the old framework was those two tended to be at odds with each other. And you ended up seeing the votes just landing in the middle, like not a positive impact, not a negative impact. And you could kind of infer from the discussion that those were washing each other out. What's happening under the new framework is the equity questions are split into two pieces so that you can really look at the clinical impact that might happen in an equity sense, and are there going to be problems with access, and separate those two. And I think that's a really positive step.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly incremental improvements are welcomed, but honestly, if ICER is never going to adopt a societal viewpoint and their focus is private payers, is equity ever going to really be a conversation that they're willing to have?
We shall see. I'm encouraged by groups like the Innovation and Value Initiative that are really making some important steps in the equity space and pushing that conversation to front and center. And I am hopeful that we will see some movement in the equity space in the future. One thing that I really do want to call out in ICER's framework is process. And again, I don't think a lot of people are focused on process. I'm a process geek. I like things like this. And if we look at the process for this update to the framework with the most recent update, which was the 2020 update, there's some real noteworthy changes. And I have concerns about transparency and stakeholder engagement.
Okay.
So in 2020, the 2020 update, we saw a very transparent process laid out. This is when the open input period is going to be. This is when ICER is going to listen to that. This is when the comment period will be. Very clear. We knew what to expect, when to expect it. There were 2 opportunities for stakeholders to engage. And together, those 2 opportunities represented almost 100 days. Lots of time for input and lots of time for ICER to process that input and think about how it wanted to incorporate it in the updated stakeholder framework. What we didn't see this time was transparency around the process. There was some indication it might happen in June, might happen in July, it might not happen till 2024. It dropped suddenly at the beginning of June with a 25-day comment period, which is much shorter than the 100 days that we had in 2020. And if you take off weekends and holidays and summer vacations, it was very short. And what did we see? Did it matter? I think it really did matter. In 2020, more than 60 unique stakeholder groups commented on ICER's framework. This year, we had half of that commenting. And where we saw the biggest drop off was in patient groups. More than 20 patient groups commented in 2020. Eight commented this time, which is not a robust start for a meaningful patient engagement program, which is one of the areas that ICER is really elevating and saying is of importance to it. And why does that matter? Why am I focusing so much on process, some of this diminished transparency, diminished opportunity for stakeholder engagement? This is why I think it matters so much. When we look to the future, where is ICER headed with its framework? We saw a couple of placeholders in this current framework for future changes that ICER might want to make. 2 examples are dynamic pricing, the idea that a price of a product changes over its life cycle. For example, when generics are introduced and we see a dropping of the price, that could be a dynamic price, changes in price. The second area that ICER flagged for potential change is a lowering of its cost effectiveness thresholds. And that's something that is opposed by a broad range of stakeholders. Now, both of these changes are things that would quantitatively impact ICER's assessment results. I talked earlier about changes that affected the qualitative narrative, and that isn't as impactful as changes that affect the quantitative results. What is the value-based price? That's the quantitative result that most payers are using in their price negotiation. So I get concerned when I see markers for future changes that could have a big impact on the quantitative result, intermingled with decreased transparency, decreased opportunity for stakeholder engagement. So that's one of the things that I'm really watching for when it comes to ICER's changes with its framework.